Hi team, I hope you're all doing really well. Today I'm doing a video that is a little bit different. I'm going to go through some numbers that loosely reflect my journey in the property market to the point that it had given me a net worth of $1 million. However, my goal here isn't merely to flex or convince you that I know everything about property. Instead, I want to introduce you to the idea of a basic personal balance sheet and how this tool can be useful as a means of tracking your financial progress as you journey through life. In this, I'm only going to talk about a few assets for simplicity, but they represent the main source of wealth growth I experienced in this period. It is probably worth highlighting that I was quite fortunate with the timing of my entry to the property market for a number of reasons. Firstly, the location of the first three properties that I purchased were all in Sydney and got to experience a degree of fairly rapid growth in value due to a huge property boom that made headlines globally in this period. Also, my property journey has been through a period where interest rates have generally been quite low and have in fact been getting lower throughout this period, making finance more accessible. Finally, it is also worth noting that these investments have been made with my wife, so we have benefited from having two incomes to achieve this. Everyone has different circumstances, and I think it is worth knowing and understanding the context behind large wealth growth because these gains are not solely my own. As may sometimes be alluded to in other videos. The figures I have used in the balance sheet are rounded numbers that are fairly close to the actual figures. The reason I've done this is just to make it a little bit easier to follow. Okay, so let's get into it. Very quickly, I want to start with introducing what a balance sheet is. A balance sheet is a type of financial document that businesses use to keep track of their assets, liabilities, and levels of equity. In this video, we will be using the same model, but on a personal individual scale. So starting with an asset, this is something that is a store of value that is owned or in the business context controlled and can be used to generate more financial power or resources. So things such as cash, bank accounts, property, shares, equipment, facilities, inventory, these things would all count as assets, as long as you can use them to boost your financial position. So for this example, I'm only going to be looking at two types of assets, and that's purely for the simplicity of this exercise, which is going to be cash, which is representative of bank accounts and money that we have on hand, and properties, as that's the asset we're looking to accrue. On the other side of the balance sheet, we firstly have liabilities, which are basically obligations you need to pay in the future. This could be things like bills, insurance, and loans. For this example, we will only be looking at one type of liability, the mortgage. I know there are other expenses associated with owning properties and just life in general, but just to keep it simple, we're only going to be focusing on the mortgage. If you wanted to get more complex with your balance sheet, you could even divide your assets and liabilities into current and non-current assets and liabilities, which has to do with the time horizon in which you are going to be using or meeting those obligations. However, we will keep it simple and just broadly use assets and liabilities, as our goal here is merely to track the growth in our equity, which brings us to the equity portion of the balance sheet. This is situated under the liabilities section. However, it is its own section. Equity is basically the residual value of the accounting entity, in this case us, individuals, or my wife and I should say. And once you add up the value of all the assets and subtract all the liabilities, you actually come to the figure of what is the equity. If this was a business, we would divide this up into a number of categories, such as retained profit and shareholder equity. As we are doing this for an individual, or my wife and I should say, we are just going to leave it as equity. When you know what your equity is, you actually know what your net worth is. So this exercise is really focused on tracking net worth over time. Finally, to check that you are completing the balance sheet correctly, if you add the figure for liabilities to the figure for equity, it should equal the value of all the assets. So the left side of the balance sheet must equal the right side, hence the term balance sheet. They balance each other out. Okay, so let's begin with my story. Okay, so from a young age, I was a relatively good saver of money, and from a very early point, I knew I wanted to buy real estate. So I had always worked and tried to save what I could throughout my time in university. Once I started working as a teacher, my savings really took off. I continued to save regularly and still worked a part-time job on the side. Just after my 26th birthday in 2013, I had managed to get my savings account to around the $120,000 mark, which is represented by the item cash in our balance sheet. As I had no liabilities at this stage, calculating my equity or net worth was fairly straightforward. So you take $120,000 and you minus all the liabilities, which is zero, gives me an equity or a net worth of $120,000. So there you're seeing the functions of the balance sheet at work. Not long after my birthday, I took the plunge and bought a 5-bedroom home for $725,000 with a mortgage of $650,000. This purchase is represented by the new asset on our balance sheet, property one, and the new liability, mortgage one. Again, when you add up all the assets and subtract the liabilities, you will arrive at my level of equity. Now, those of you who are mathematically inclined or already know your way around a balance sheet would have perhaps been shocked to realize that my net worth actually dropped from making the purchase. It was initially $120,000 and now it is down to $95,000. The reason is simple. When buying a property in Australia, just like most other markets, there are a number of other expenses that can really add up at the time of purchase, such as stamp duty and mortgage insurance. On a side note, I was actually a bit annoyed because the New South Wales government literally changed the rules for some of the first home buyer benefits that are offered just a few weeks before I made my purchase, which resulted in losing out on some of the benefits and meaning I had to pay more money up front for these purchases. Anyway, this trend of seeing a slight dip in net worth just after a purchase will be quite common throughout this exercise. Okay, so moving on, I did mention at the start that we were quite fortunate with the timing with which we got into the property market, as this initial purchase was early on into a long-running property boom, particularly in Sydney. So the value of my purchase actually shot up quite quickly, and best still, I was now receiving another stream of income from the property. To give you an idea of how quickly the property went up, about 6 months later in April 2014, the bank revalued the property at a whopping $950,000. I actually couldn't believe it. It's only now when I reflect back on this, I realize how lucky I was with the time of that purchase. As the house was generating an income and I was still working 2 jobs, I had managed to make a small inroad into the mortgage of about $10,000 and had managed to build up cash in a mortgage offset account to around $50,000. So this was the first time I had assets that were valued at $1 million. At this stage, there was still a lot of hype in the property market, and it just seemed like a good opportunity to expand the property portfolio. So using a lot of the excess cash that we held, as well as cross-collateralizing the equity from the first property, we were able to secure a 2-bedroom townhouse in a cheaper area for $440,000. So please note the change in the cash item and the introduction of property 2 and mortgage 2 to our balance sheet. And again, observe the slight drop in the equity column due to the expenses associated with buying this property. Moving forward, this crazy property boom in Sydney still continued. However, there were signs that some areas had started to slow down, but there was still a lot of enthusiasm. Over the space of about 20 months, our financial position started to shore up more. The 2 properties did increase in value further, with the first property actually surpassing the $1 million mark. We were receiving 2 streams of income from the properties and had managed to put a further dent into the mortgages on the properties. In this time, we were also quite fortunate to be gifted a considerable sum of money to put towards purchasing a property for us to live in, which is why you see the significant increase in the cash column. We did not want to further collateralize the existing mortgages. We wanted the mortgage on our new property to remain separate to the existing properties, which was a bit of a headache to organise, but as you can see, it also involved a new valuation of the existing properties, and both had still had further healthy increases while providing us with good income throughout this period. At this point, the level of equity had now grown to $755,000. So the next balance sheet shows the purchase of the new property with a 20% deposit in February of 2016. So there is a new property under assets and a new mortgage under liabilities. Again, we saw the pattern of equity dropping. I do want to make it clear that we would not have been able to make this third purchase when we did without the injection of cash that we had. Realistically, to do so, we would have had to grow our cash balance to this level that it was at prior to the purchase, which would have possibly taken another 2 years approximately. So it perhaps accelerated our property journey by 2 or maybe 3 years. However, saying that, there was still the option of collateralizing the debt, which may have allowed us to still make a purchase around this time, or maybe not too far into the future. As we were living in our own property now, we were not receiving an income on the property, and we had started using excess cash to pay down some of the debt. And we also branched out into other assets as well. We also became quite routine travelers and got married in this time. So we had sort of unofficially decided to give ourselves a bit of a break from putting as much energy and resources into our properties, and instead started to enjoy our late 20s and the start of our 30s with a little more luxury. So basically we were spending more than we had before. The property boom was still going in this period. We did see a smaller and less desirable property in the same complex as our new property sell for a crazy $825,000. So that made us feel really good about the purchase and gave us an indication that prices had still been going up at this stage. However, the property boom did come to an end in 2017, and there were talks and data to show that property prices and demand were softening. About a year later, in January of 2019, we had a good opportunity to purchase a piece of land interstate in Victoria. So we went through the process of getting our finances assessed, including revaluing the 3 properties. So while it was known that properties had been declining slightly in value over the past few months leading up to this, all the properties were still up from their previous valuations. So the equity figure of our net worth figure was now at a cool $1.1 million. While the figure was potentially higher a few months previously, it was pretty cool realization that we had seen the equity value of our properties we owned surpass the $1 million mark. From the time of this last balance sheet, my wife and I have since made other moves in the property market, but for the purposes of this exercise, this is where I want to stop at, as I think it has given a nice overview of how just an average person can build wealth through property investments, and has demonstrated how you can use a personal balance sheet to track your net worth. Some people out there could definitely have made more in those market conditions than we did, but the reality is we were very happy with what we did, and upon reflection, I feel we did take pretty good advantage of the market conditions. But I will say that we were very fortunate with timing and market conditions. We were definitely in the right place at the right time. It's also worth noting that even though these properties have been valued at this level, really a property is only worth what someone's willing to pay for it. So while the bank might say, yeah, you could get this for it, you don't really know what it's worth till you go to sell it. So that's something worth thinking about. With final regards to the balance sheet exercise, this is something I don't do too regularly, but it could be a useful exercise for tracking your wealth if you were to complete one at regular intervals, such as at the end of the month, end of the quarter, end of the year. It's perhaps something I might try to do a little more regularly into the future. Anyway, I hope you guys found this informative. Let me know what you thought, or ask me any questions you may have in the comments below. Until next time, thanks for watching. Take care, guys.